Monolith versus microservice. If you go to internet and check which one is better over the others, you will find lots of opinions and lot of reasons why one should be preferred over the other. I agree that many of the times these reasons and rationales are valid. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to share my share of experience while working with multiple companies where I've seen one being used more than the other in some of the cases, while the other being used more than the first one in some of the use cases. So let's get started. So I'll take one example of a booking system. I was part of a company called as Yatra, and since it's a travel company, it has bunch of things. For example, you search for a source to destination on a particular date, then you select a particular flight, and then you add the passenger detail, and then you make the payment. So a simple flow from left to right. Now, initially, that system was a monolith system, and when it was monolith, there were a bunch of challenges. The first one was that we had one single repo to do everything and one single deployment. So these two things could be different as well. I'll talk later, but we had one single repo in Git where we had search. Then all these things were different folders in the same repo and were sort of coding in different folders based on what our responsibilities were. The problem with this one was that the moment you change one thing here, you have to test everything, including payments, including booking, etc. Right? So the search feature might not be as critical, or let's say the promo code or a marketing feature might not be as critical compared to the payments. But if you are getting out of memory error elsewhere, it can impact this one as well. So that was one problem that let's say you get out of memory error in a marketing campaign where you are trying to give a marketing notification to the customer. It can impact the payment. So the critical and non-critical flows were being merged together. And for a smaller scale, it was fine. It was working fine. But eventually what happened was that we moved to a microservice-based architecture. So we had multiple services like search service was a separate service, booking service was a separate, likewise payments, multiple services, like hundreds of services were there for various use cases. The advantage was that now you had smaller repos. So all these repos were smaller repos and different teams or different people can start to work on that repo. So the people responsible for search, they used to work on their own repo, used to interact with Elasticsearch, that's it. Then the booking, there were separate people who were working and interacting with their own databases. And then there were a syncing service which used to sync the data to Elasticsearch and they used to maintain Kafka. So the responsibilities were clearly divided. It doesn't matter if the teams are merged or not, that's a separate use case. But the easier thing was that now the deployment was easy. You can clone any of the repo and start coding. So the dev velocity was better compared to in the mono repos or the monolith repos where many times I have seen I had to spend 2 or 3 days just to clone the repo, run it and understand it. Here it was just a 10 minutes thing. The other is, of course, you could scale the services independently. So imagine that the number of people trying to search would be way more than number of people trying to make the payment. So the payment requires different type of approach compared to the search. So search, it requires a lot of scale. Say 100 people trying to search something and only 10 people making the actual booking. So the different amount of scales are required. The critical features and non-critical features could also be separated. For example, the marketing campaign and all those things, they are not critical compared to the payment. You could separate them as well. So it makes things easy. It divides the things into the logical partition and it just makes things easier to work. So that was the thing that when I was working on the companies like Adobe and Yatra, there the microservice architecture with a smaller repo was being preferred. I'm not going to claim that all the teams in Yatra and Adobe were using this, but this is something which was there in my team. I can't comment on other use cases, but wherever I was working, these are the use cases which were there. But when I was working in Microsoft, so there they followed an interesting approach. So it was the microservice. Of course, when you deploy, all these components were getting deployed individually. But when you are coding in a one single repo and you had multiple projects in that repo. And while you're coding, the call from service 1 to service 2 is just a method call. But when it is deployed, it's deployed as a separate service. So that was the thing which they try to follow. I still feel that it has its own disadvantage. It had very large repo, around 40 people or even more. I don't know how many were contributing to that repo. So it became quite complex. And when you clone the repo, run it on local, it was really hard compared to the microservice architecture. So here, of course, the dev velocity is slightly less compared to the microservice architecture. But then again, people try to find the balance. But if your use case is really simple and you don't have a very complex use case, you have a smaller team of 10 people, then of course, I feel that the monolith or a single repo will be easier. You don't have to manage a lot of things. So there are pros and cons. I just shared my share of experience where I have worked, but they might not necessarily be true in your case. And of course, there are a lot of people to talk about their own experiences and their own fundamentals and principles which they have seen. So that's it from my side for this video. I hope this video was helpful. Till the next time, bye.